The soft glow of pendant lights reflected off the polished mahogany tables of Aurelia, Atlanta's most guarded culinary secret. Simone Carter adjusted her sleek black vest for the third time that night, her hands trembling, not from the pressure of the high-stakes dinner rush, but from the crushing weight of the secret she carried beneath her skin. At 22, Simone was a master of the unseen. She moved through the dining room like a well-dressed shadow, offering a rehearsed smile that never quite reached her eyes. For 6 months, she had lived this double life, grateful for a job that funded her linguistics degree and kept her miles away from the violent legacy of the Vance family name. "Table 4 needs a clear," the manager hissed, nodding toward the corner booth. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. Lee Dong-yoon sat with the rigid posture of a man who owned the city's shadows, his dark, tailored suit barely concealing the intricate tattoos creeping up his neck. Beside him, his mother, Young-suk, sat with a quiet, silver-haired authority that commanded respect even in her silence. While the rest of the staff hovered in terror, Simone's eyes locked onto the older woman's hands. Young-suk was deaf, making small, frustrated gestures that her son was too distracted to see. Ignoring every instinct to remain invisible, Simone set her tray aside and stepped into the dragon's lair. Her hands rose, moving with a fluid, practiced grace that only a true scholar of language could possess. "The tea is too hot, isn't it, Madame?" she signed in a rare regional Korean dialect. The restaurant fell into a deafening silence. Lee Dong-yun froze, his sharp gaze snapping up to fix on the waitress with an intensity that made Simone's breath hitch. She had just broken her first rule of survival: never let them see who you really are. The restaurant fell into a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that usually precedes a storm. Simone stood frozen, her fingers still shaped in the final character of the sentence she had just signed. She could feel the heat rising in her neck, a stark contrast to the icy professionalism she had maintained for months. Young-suk's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and profound relief. She reached out, her aged fingers trembling as she tapped Simone's hand in a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a brand. Behind her, Lee Dong-hyun didn't move, yet his presence seemed to expand, filling the small pocket of space between them. "Where did you learn to sign like that?" he asked. His voice was a low, melodic baritone, but it carried the serrated edge of a man used to being obeyed without question. Simone forced herself to lower her hands slowly, tucking them behind her back to hide the tremor that had returned with a vengeance. "I grew up with a friend who was deaf, sir," she lied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "It's just a skill I kept up." She tried to offer a polite, distant smile, the ghost smile that had served her so well. But Dong-hyun rose from his seat. He was taller than he looked while sitting, a predatory grace in his movements that made the air feel thin. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and old money. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, scanned her face with a terrifying level of detail. "A friend," he repeated, the words trailing off into a hum of disbelief. "You use the Busan dialect, a specific variant used by families of status 40 years ago. That isn't something one simply picks up from a friend in Atlanta." He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her hands, then back to her eyes. "And your posture? You don't stand like a waitress. You stand like someone who is used to being looked at, but terrified of being seen." Simone felt the walls of her sanctuary beginning to crumble. She shifted her weight, a subtle movement, but his eyes tracked it instantly. "Your accent, too," he murmured, leaning in until his voice was a private confidence. "There's a softness to your vowels. Savannah? or perhaps further south. It's a slip, Simone, if that is even your name. You flinch when the heavy doors in the kitchen slam, as if you're expecting a gunshot, not a tray of dishes. I have work to do, Mr. Lee, Simone whispered, her pulse thundering in her ears. She turned to retreat, but his hand shot out, not grabbing, but resting firmly on the table edge, effectively blocking her path. I don't like mysteries in my peripheral vision, Dong Yun said, his tone dropping into something more dangerous than curiosity. Especially not when they come dressed in a uniform and speak the private language of my mother. Who are you really, and why are you hiding in the light of this restaurant? The intensity in his gaze was a challenge, a silent demand for the truth she had spent 2 years running from. Simone looked into the eyes of the dragon and realized for the first time that her invisibility hadn't been a shield, it had been a countdown. The silence at the table was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Simone felt the eyes of the other diners, the elite, the wealthy, the blissfully ignorant, as a blurred backdrop to the piercing focus of Lee Dong-hyun. He didn't wait for her to break. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thin, sleek tablet. With a flick of his thumb, he turned the screen toward her. The image was grainy, a security feed from a rain-slicked street in Savannah 2 years ago. It showed a woman who looked exactly like Simone, though her hair was longer and her expression was one of raw, jagged terror, rather than the polished mask she wore now. She was climbing into a bus, leaving behind a sprawling estate that the local news had dubbed the Vance Fortress. Simone Vance, Dong-hyun said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a physical touch. The daughter of Elijah Vance, the man who holds the keys to every shipping container and back alley deal on the East Coast. The girl who went missing in the middle of a blood feud, leaving her father to assume she was either dead or taken by his enemies. Simone's knees felt weak, and she reached out to steady herself against the mahogany table. The name Vance sounded like a gunshot in the quiet elegance of the restaurant. It was a name associated with iron-fisted rule and a syndicate that had been at war with families like the Lees for generations. "I am Simone Carter now," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I don't have a father. I have a tuition bill and a history exam on Monday. That life is gone." Dong-hyun's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something, perhaps recognition of a shared burden, passed through his eyes. "You can change your name, and you can change your hair, but you cannot change the blood in your veins," he said, leaning back as he watched her reaction. "You ran away to save yourself, to find a normal life. But while you were practicing your art of invisibility here in Atlanta, the world you left behind didn't stop turning." He leaned forward again, his tattooed neck tensing. "Your father is losing control, Simone. His own house is divided, and the men he trusts most are looking for a reason to burn the Vance legacy to the ground. They aren't just looking for him anymore. They are looking for the daughter who knows his secrets, the one who could be used to make him crumble." Simone looked at the tablet again, then at young Suk, who was watching the exchange with a profound, silent sadness. The ghost Simone had spent months building was evaporating, leaving behind a woman who was suddenly, terrifyingly visible. "Why are you telling me this?" Simone asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Because," Dong-hyun replied, his gaze unyielding, "our enemies and mine have found a common interest, and unfortunately for you, they've found where you work." The air in the restaurant, once thick with the scent of saffron and expensive wine, suddenly turned stale. Simone's gaze darted toward the entrance, pulled by a primitive instinct for survival she had tried so hard to unlearn. Standing at the polished mahogany bar was a man who looked like a jagged tear in a silk curtain. He was stocky, wearing a leather jacket that had seen too many nights in the rain, and a jagged scar cut through his eyebrow, pulling his eyelid into a permanent, mocking sneer. It was Marcus the Mallet Reed. He was her father's most clinical enforcer, the man sent when a message needed to be delivered in blood. Simone ducked her head, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she was certain Dong-young could hear it. She tried to melt back into the shadows of the service station, but it was too late. Marcus wasn't looking for a drink. He was holding a photograph, showing it to the terrified bartender. When the bartender's eyes flickered towards Simone for a fraction of a second, the trap snapped shut. Marcus turned, his eyes, cold and empty as a winter's grave, locked onto hers. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face. He didn't rush. He moved with the agonizing patience of a predator who knew the exit was blocked. "Princess," he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the hushed dinner music. "Your father's been worried sick, said you went off to play house in the city." The diners at the nearby tables began to murmur, their faces pale as they realized the violence simmering just feet away. Simone felt the familiar paralysis of her childhood, the feeling of being a pawn in a game she never asked to play. She looked at Dong-young, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Dong-young didn't flinch. He remained seated, his expression unreadable, but his hand moved subtly beneath the table. The restrained power she had sensed earlier was now a coiled spring. "You're making a scene, Marcus," Simone whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't belong to him anymore. I left that life." "No one ever truly leaves, Simone," countered Marcus, echoing the very words Dong-young had spoken moments before. He stepped closer, reaching for the heavy brass rail of the bar. "The Vance family doesn't lose assets, and right now you're the most valuable asset your father has left to trade." As Marcus took another step, the heavy double doors of the kitchen swung open, and two of Dong-young's men stepped out, their hands hidden inside their jackets. The restaurant had become a chessboard, and Simone was caught in the center of a killing floor. Her carefully constructed life as a ghost was gone. The shadows had finally caught up to her, and they were thirsty. The dining room erupted into a symphony of crashing glass and overturned chairs as diners scrambled away from the brewing storm. Marcus Reed took a heavy step forward, his eyes fixed on Simone with a terrifying singular focus. But before he could reach the table, Dong-hyun moved. With a speed that betrayed his calm exterior, he caught Simone's wrist and pulled her behind the bulkhead of his chair. "Not tonight, Marcus," Dong-hyun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low vibration that cut through the chaos. Two of Dong-hyun's associates stepped into Marcus's path, their hands resting meaningfully under their lapels. The standoff was a taut wire, ready to snap. Dong-hyun leaned in close to Simone, his breath warm against her ear. "The front is burned. If you go out those doors, you're a prisoner or a corpse by midnight." He didn't wait for her to agree. He steered her toward the back of the restaurant, his grip firm and grounding. They bypassed the panicked waitstaff and dove into the silver and steel heat of the kitchen. "There's a service corridor," Dong-hyun explained, his voice a steady anchor in the sea of her rising panic. He kicked open a nondescript gray door near the industrial walk-in freezer. It led to a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled of damp concrete and old brick, a secret vein running through the heart of the city's architecture. Simone's breath came in jagged gasps as they ran. The elegant life she had fought to build, the linguistics exams, the quiet apartment, the hard-won anonymity, was dissolving with every footfall on the cold floor. "My things! My roommate!" she whispered, her mind racing toward the normal life she was leaving behind. "Your roommate will be told you had a family emergency. Your classes will wait, but only if you stay alive long enough to attend them." They reached a heavy iron door at the end of the passage. Dong-hyun pushed it open, and the humid Atlanta night air hit Simone like a physical weight. A black SUV idled in the shadows of the alley, its headlights dark. A driver named Carlo stood by the rear door, his face a mask of professional stillness. Dong-hyun turned to her, the flickering street lamp catching the sharp line of his jaw and the dark ink on his neck. He slid a sleek, untraceable phone into her hand. "Go. He'll take you to the lakeside safe house. My mother is already on her way." "Why?" Simone asked, looking at the man who was her family's sworn enemy. "Why risk a war for me?" Dong-hyun's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He said, "Because you saw my mother when no one else would, and in this world, kindness is the only thing worth starting a war over." He shut the door, and as the SUV pulled away into the darkness, Simone felt the ghost of her old life vanish in the rearview mirror. The lakeside cabin was a pocket of impossible silence, tucked away where the humid Georgia pines met the glass-like surface of the water. It was a place where the air didn't taste of exhaust and adrenaline, but of cedar and rain. For 3 days, the safe house had been Simone's world, a sanctuary that felt more like a dream than the reality she had left behind in the flickering lights of the restaurant. Inside, the rustic kitchen was filled with the rhythmic clink of porcelain. Simone sat across from Mrs. Lee, who moved with a grace that seemed to defy the chaos currently consuming the city. The older woman placed a steaming cup of barley tea in front of Simone, her kind eyes reading the exhaustion etched into Simone's face. Without a word, young Suk's hands began to move, signing with a slow, deliberate clarity that felt like a bridge over a chasm. "My son does not bring ghosts here," young Suk signed, her expression softening into a knowing smile. "He only brings those who he hopes will find their soul again." Simone watched the elegant dance of her fingers, feeling a lump form in her throat. "He risked a lot for me," Simone signed, her movements fluid but heavy with guilt. "My father's men don't forgive. I've brought danger to your doorstep." Young Suk shook her head, her silver hair catching the morning light. She began to tell a story of a younger Dong-hyun, a boy who had been groomed for cruelty by a father who saw mercy as a fatal flaw. She described how he had quietly dismantled the most brutal parts of his father's empire from the inside, replacing raw violence with strategic alliances and community support. "Dong-hyun does not want a war," she signed, her eyes glowing with a fierce maternal pride. "He wants a legacy that doesn't require a funeral every week. He saw you in that restaurant, not just a girl who knew our language, but a kindred spirit trying to escape a cage built by men who only know how to take." Simone realized then that Dong-hyun's interest in her wasn't just about tactical leverage or her father's secrets. He was looking for a way to end a cycle of blood that spanned generations. He wasn't just hiding her, he was protecting a version of the future that he couldn't build alone. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the wooden floor, the burner phone on the windowsill vibrated. Simone picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she read the simple message. "Evidence found. It's deeper than we thought. Stay ready." Looking at young Suk, who was peacefully tending to a small pot of herbs by the window, Simone felt a new kind of resolve. She had spent years running from her name, but in this house of silence, she realized that some things were worth standing for. She wasn't just a waitress or a runaway anymore. She was part of a plan to turn old enemies into the foundation of a new peace. The stillness of the safe house was shattered not by a sound, but by the cold blue light of the laptop screen Dong-yun placed on the heavy oak table. He had arrived an hour after midnight, the scent of rain and city soot clinging to his coat, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction. Simone leaned forward, her breath hitching as the screen flickered to life, revealing a world of digital shadows she had hoped to never see again. "We cracked the encrypted drives Marcus was carrying," Dong-yun said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "It isn't just a search for a runaway daughter, Simone. It's a liquidation." As Simone scrolled through the files, the barley tea in her stomach turned to lead. There, in stark black and white, were surveillance photos of a quiet campus in North Carolina, the very place where her younger brothers, Marcus Jr. and Leo, were supposed to be hidden and safe under their father's protection. Beside the photos were time-stamped logs of their daily routines, what time they left their dorms, which library they frequented, and the names of the 2 guards her father had assigned to them, guards who, according to the messages below, had already been paid to look the other way. "The coup is already in motion," Dong-yun murmured, pointing to a series of wire transfers from a Russian account to her father's most trusted lieutenant, Sean Vance, her own uncle. "He isn't waiting for your father to step down," Dong-yun murmured. "He's clearing the bloodline. He knows that as long as your brothers are alive, his claim to the Vance throne is temporary. They are the collateral damage that ensures his total control." Simone's vision blurred as she read an intercepted text. "Target Alpha and Beta to be neutralized during the neutral site meeting. No witnesses." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father was being lured into a trap under the guise of a peace talk, and while he was busy defending his territory, her brothers would be executed in their sleep. The fear that had paralyzed her in the restaurant was suddenly replaced by a cold, searing clarity. She looked at the photos of her brothers, their smiles unsuspecting, their lives hanging by a fraying thread. For years she had run to save herself, thinking her distance was a shield for them. Now she saw the truth. Her invisibility had left them vulnerable. "He's going to kill them tonight, isn't he?" she whispered, her hands steady for the first time since the night at Aurelia. "Unless we move first," Dong-yun replied, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh light of the betrayal on the screen. "We have a team within 10 miles of their campus, but they won't move without a signal from someone they trust. They need to know this isn't an Italian play for the boys." Simone stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. She looked at Mrs. Lee, who signed a single powerful word: fight. "Tell your men to stand by," Simone said, her voice dropping into the command tone she had inherited from her father. "I'm done being a ghost. If Sean wants the Vance legacy, he's going to have to face the one person he forgot to count." The transition from prey to protector happened in the space of a single breath. Simone stood in the center of the safe house, the digital evidence of her uncle's betrayal still glowing on the laptop screen like a neon confession. For 2 years, she had viewed her voice as a liability, a silken thread that could lead the monsters of her past straight to her throat. But as she looked at the photos of her younger brothers, she realized that silence wasn't safety. It was a vacuum that her enemies were filling with blood. "I've spent so much time trying to be a ghost that I forgot I have the power to haunt them," Simone said, her voice dropping into a register of cold authority that startled even herself. She turned to Dong Yan, her eyes burning with a resolve that transcended the fear of the restaurant. If I stay here, my brothers die, and my father becomes a martyr for a liar. I'm not running anymore. Dong Yan watched her, a slow, respectful nod acknowledging the shift in the room's energy. The neutral site meeting is in 4 hours at the port of Savannah. Your uncle has framed it as a final negotiation between the Vance and Lee interests. He expects to walk out as the sole survivor of both legacies. Simone moved to the window, watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. She began to formulate a plan, her linguistics training finally merging with the tactical instincts she had suppressed for so long. She knew the dialects of the docks, the private codes the enforcers used, and the hidden architectural quirks of her father's territory. She wasn't just a waitress, she was the only person who could move between these two warring worlds undetected. "I can get inside," she said, turning back to the table. "I know the service tunnels under the shipping offices. If I can get to the central comms, I can broadcast the evidence of the coup directly to my father's loyalists before the first shot is fired. But I need your men to intercept the hit squad sent for my brothers." Dong Yan stepped forward, his hand coming to rest briefly on her shoulder, an gesture of alliance that felt like the forging of a new world. "My team is already moving to the campus. They will be protected, Simone. But the docks will be a hornet's nest. Once you step out of the shadows, there is no going back to the life of a quiet waitress." Simone looked at Mrs. Lee, who was watching from the doorway. The older woman raised her hands and signed a final blessing. "The truth is a flame. It may burn, but it lights the way home." Simone took a deep breath, the air in the cabin no longer feeling like a sanctuary, but like the calm before a righteous storm. She reached for her jacket, shedding the last remnants of her ghost persona. She was no longer Simone Carter, the student hiding from her shadow. She was Simone Vance, and she was going back to claim her voice. The port of Savannah was a labyrinth of towering steel containers and thick, salty fog that swallowed the sound of the Atlantic. Simone moved through the shadows of Warehouse 14, not as a victim, but as a ghost reclaiming its haunting grounds. She wore a dark utility jacket, her hair tucked tightly under a cap, her movements echoing the silent grace she had practiced in the Isles of Aurelia. She navigated the rusted service tunnels with a scholar's memory, emerging onto a narrow catwalk draped in darkness. Below her, the stage was set for a massacre. Her father, Elijah Vance, sat at a heavy iron table, looking older and more tired than she remembered. Opposite him sat her uncle Sean, his face twisted into a mask of false concern. Between them lay a bottle of vintage whiskey, the traditional seal for a peace offering. "To the future of the Vance legacy," Sean toasted, his voice echoing through the hollow warehouse. Simone saw the signal. Marcus Reed, lurking in the rafters across from her, raised a suppressed rifle, his eye level with the scope. He wasn't aiming at her father. He was waiting for the whiskey to hit Elijah's lips before clearing the room of witnesses. Simone didn't scream, she acted. She reached the central comms hub bolted to the catwalk railing and jammed Dong Yun's modified drive into the port. "Look at the screens, Dad!" Her voice rang out, amplified by the warehouse's industrial speakers, vibrating with a power that stopped Elijah's hand mid-air. Suddenly, the massive monitors used for cargo tracking flickered to life, displaying the intercepted messages, the wire transfers, and the horrifying photos of the hit squad outside her brother's dorms. The silence that followed was deafening. "Simone," Elijah whispered, his eyes searching the shadows. Sean's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "It's a lie, a fabrication by the Lees." "The Lees saved your nephews tonight, Sean," Simone shouted, stepping into the edge of the industrial floodlights, her silhouette tall and unyielding. "While you were selling our blood to the Russians." Marcus Reed pulled the trigger, but Simone had already anticipated the move. She dived behind a steel pillar as the bullets sparked off the railing. In that heartbeat of chaos, the warehouse doors thundered open. Dongyun's men swarmed in from the north, while Elijah's loyalists, seeing the proof of betrayal on the screens, turned their weapons on Sean's inner circle. The assassination attempt dissolved into a frantic scramble for survival. Sean tried to bolt for the rear exit, but he was met by the cold, dark barrel of Dongyun's pistol. Simone watched from above as the man who had tried to erase her family was forced to his knees. The war that was supposed to burn the city had been snuffed out by a single voice, the voice of a girl who had finally stopped being quiet. The dust in the warehouse settled as the first light of dawn filtered through the high, grime-streaked windows, turning the swirling fog into a soft, golden haze. The silence that followed the chaos was not the empty, fearful quiet Simone had lived in for years, but a heavy, transformative peace. Her father, Elijah, stood among his most loyal men, his gaze fixed on the daughter he had mourned as a ghost. He didn't see a runaway anymore. He saw the woman who had saved his legacy and his sons. Dong-hyun stepped toward the center of the room, his movements no longer predatory, but measured and respectful. He stopped before Elijah, not reaching for a weapon, but offering his hand in a gesture that would have been unthinkable 24 hours ago. "The blood that was supposed to be spilled tonight belonged to your brothers and mine," Dong-hyun said, his voice echoing with a new authority. "Instead, we find ourselves standing because of the courage of one woman who refused to let our histories define our future. The war ends here, Elijah, not because we are weak, but because we are stronger as allies." Elijah looked at his daughter, then at the man who had protected her, and slowly took the hand. It was a historic bridge between two worlds, the Black and Korean syndicates finally finding a common ground built on the survival of their children. Months later, the humid heat of the Atlanta afternoon felt different to Simone. She stood on the balcony of a new lakeside home. The linguistics textbooks on the table beside her no longer felt like a hiding place, but a promise. The Vance and Lee families were no longer names whispered in fear, but pillars of a community-focused coalition that Mrs. Lee had championed from the start. Simone felt a presence behind her and didn't flinch. She knew the scent of sandalwood and the weight of that specific, restrained power. Dong-hyun joined her at the railing, his dark eyes reflecting the calm water. "No more running?" his hands moving with the easy familiarity they had cultivated in the quiet hours of the safe house. Simone smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and stayed there. "No more running," she signed back. "I finally like the sound of my own voice." As the sun dipped below the tree line, Simone realized that she had found something better than invisibility. She had found a life where she could be exactly who she was: a daughter, a sister, a scholar, and a partner. The shy waitress was gone, replaced by a woman who had used the power of language to silence a war and find a home in the arms of the man who had seen her all along. In a world of shadows, sometimes a single voice is all it takes to change everything. Thank you for walking this journey with Simone and Dong-hyun. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. To see more stories of hidden lives and unlikely alliances, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel and allows me to keep bringing these worlds to life.